All right, so welcome the two of you who are on the call with us tonight. So I really appreciate, or three, there's a third person in the back there. Appreciate you joining us tonight to talk about our rights as LGBTQ folks here in Indiana specifically. My name is H.R. Jung. I'm the Executive Director here at the LGBTQ Center, and we're real lucky to have Megan Stuart with the Indiana Legal Services here tonight and Kit Malone with ACLU of Indiana. And they're here to kind of help answer some of our questions and, you know, make us think maybe and give us some more information about some ways that we can maybe be a little bit more of an advocate for ourselves and for others within the community. Also on the call tonight is Michael McMillian. He's our program assistant here at the LGBTQ Center to kind of help us field questions and just, yeah, have some fun. So before we get started, I also want to thank the Pokagon Fund. They sponsor our educational series. So thank you to the Pokagon Fund and their support in what we do here. So I'm going to hand this off to either Kit or Megan, whoever wants to start. Just introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about what you do and what your organizations do.
Start. So I'm Kit Malone, and I use she, her pronouns. And at the ACLU of Indiana, I lead our LGBTQ rights project, which is a statewide sort of all points effort to advocate for LGBTQ people, for the expansion of rights for LGBTQ people, to fight legislative attacks against the rights of LGBTQ people that happen in Indiana every year, and to act as a source of community support and organizing out there. My favorite part of that work is our TEAP program, our Trans Education and Advocacy program. I lead a contingent of about 40 trans advocates in places, rural places, and in the cities all over the state. And we come together, for instance, during session to push back on lawmakers and to do lobbying work and also to organize events together. I'm really proud of some of the work those folks have done, including starting a couple of really great trans advocacy groups and organizations, like the Gender Warriors in Evansville, and a couple of groups in Bloomington, and I'm just really proud of that work. So that's what I do.
And I'm Megan Stuart. I'm the director of the LGBT Law Project at Indiana Legal Services. I'm a little project in a big organization. Indiana Legal Services is a statewide legal aid organization that serves low-income Hoosiers on a variety of legal issues that don't necessarily relate to being LGBT, like expungements, divorce, evictions, sort of like run-of-the-mill things, that legal issues that people have. And then my project deals specifically with issues that relate to people being LGBT. So we do a lot of name and gender marker changes, school advocacy, discrimination in the workplace, helping getting insurance coverage for gender-affirming care. We do some other things like evictions or divorces if the issues in those cases relate to the clients being LGBT. And we
Awesome.
we serve the whole state too.
Yes.
Also, Megan is one of my badass lawyer crushes. Doing it incredible work. So
yeah. I do want to give a shout out to ACLU this year put on a great State House Day just for LGBTQ folk, which was a lot of fun and really cool to be a part of. So big shout out for that, and looking forward to 2021 and doing that again. So yay.
Or doing it virtually, only the Lord knows what it looks like.
That's fair. That's very fair. Normally we would do this in-house, but here we are on Zoom. So yeah, so one of the biggest questions I know we get here at the center, and I always happily refer them on to Megan, is how can I change my name and gender marker on all my identification documents? So that's probably the biggest question I get on a daily basis from people who are seeking that kind of information. So.
And it's really easy in Indiana. To update your name everywhere, you need a court order. And then to update your gender marker Most places you need a doctor's letter, although if you were born in Indiana and you want to update your Indiana birth certificate, you also need a court order for a gender marker change. People born in other states, California, New York, need none of that. You just need a letter that's like, this is my gender. I know best. Love, Megan. But the name and gender marker change legal process is relatively straightforward. The law is pretty clear. You can get a name change if you're doing so basically to not defraud anyone. So if I went to court and I was like, hi, I want to change my name to Kit Malone so I can pretend to be Kit Malone, a judge can say no to that. But if I say I want to change my name to Megan Stuart because I want it to match my gender identity, then the judges basically have to say yes to that. And there's a way under Indiana law to make the records of that name change private. So if someone's like stalking you online or just creeping around, they can't easily see that you've had a name and gender marker change. But the trick, I'm going to say, so the process is easy, but the trick is that how is the judge in your county applying that law? And that's where we come in. Like no one should need me to get a name and gender marker change. It should be easy and straightforward everywhere. But some judges need more education than others.
Absolutely.
Once you get those pieces of paper saying your name is changed, there's a lot of running around, and that's when you can actually start updating your documents. And you go Social Security, BMV, birth certificate, banks, update your voter registration, all that kind of good stuff.
Yeah, and I will say thank you, Kit, for putting up that link to the Indiana Legal Services gender marker change name and gender marker.
I think it only went to your private.
Oh, it did.
You'll have to copy and paste that to everybody.
Yeah, I'm going to do that right now.
ILs did put together a really great guide on doing this that I send people to all the time and use it. So it's just thanks to Megan and the crew for making that happen.
Yeah, and we'll help anyone. So if you call us and if we don't have the capacity to actually represent folks, or if you're in a county where we know it's going to be good and you don't need us, we'll draft all the paperwork and give you step-by-step instructions about how to do that.
And Megan, real quick, what's the cost for people to use Indiana Legal Services?
It's $0. It costs $0. And there's also a way. It costs $157 to start the court case, but there's a way to ask the court to not make you pay that if you can show that you just can't afford that.
Mm-hmm.
And I also want to just clarify when Megan mentioned, we want to make sure that we're not changing our names to defraud or to impersonate anyone. I definitely did kill and eat the original Kit Malone. And that is, and so I mean, I know that's a legal gray area. The thing about making smart aleck comments on
Zoom,
you can't tell if they land.
You can't read the room. I know. I'll laugh out loud for you if that makes that easier. Yeah, I just changed it to where people can send something out to the whole group. So if you've got questions, that's right before it was just sending to me. But from now on, you can share that out to everybody. And also just let you know, any links or any websites we refer to this evening, we'll have that available with this video on our website. Give us about a week, just because we've not done this before, and we're not technologically savvy. So hopefully we'll have that all up and all in one area, so you can just access all of that as well. So kind of speaking about the gender marker change, there was something that came up in the news about a little over a year ago, talking about a non-binary gender marker. And I know some people have some confusion about that. And if you all can talk about that and just kind of clarify where we are with that, what's actually happening and what's not actually happening. I know.
I feel like Meg and I have both tag teamed this exact primer so many times because of how confusing it's been and how confusing that journey's been. But I'm going to let Megan take this one because I know that they have over there at ILS have done a lot on this issue.
Yes. So it used to be like, we would be like, hey, do a non-binary ID. And the BMV would be like, shh, okay. And then people would get it. Then the larger world found out that the BMV and the health department was doing with their version of non-binary gender markers on birth certificates, and there was a giant legislative backlash, which the ACLU fixed for all of us so that the law wasn't changed to prevent that from happening. But sort of with that political background, the BMV stopped issuing IDs with X gender markers, even though they had been doing it. And my legal opinion is that the law is very clear that they should be doing that, and they have the authority to do that. And then there was this whole like internal BMV process that I'm not going to get into, where they're like, we're going to change the rule, we're not going to change the rule, we're going to change the rule. And I was like, don't change the rule. And the religious right was like, don't change the rule. And I was like, we shouldn't be agreeing about this. And then the Attorney General was like, BMV, you can't do non-binary gender markers because one time a dictionary in 1993 said that sex was binary. And we were like, what? No. So we have been advocating with the BMV to again issue non-binary IDs. I hope, I don't know, in my mind, August is fall, but I know it is summer. So by late summer, early fall, we'll hopefully have some understanding, and the BMV will either very clearly say, yes, we are doing this again, or no, we are not doing this. And then with our friends at the ACLU, we can sort of figure out what other advocacy strategies would make sense so that people get accurate and affirming ID.
And I just one additional detail to that story that was fun for all of us at the time was that the news of the BMV was making non-binary gender markers available really hit at the moment that Indiana, a couple of years ago, if some of you may remember, was in a heated debate over whether transgender people should be included in Indiana's hate crimes law. And the issue of trans people sort of got wrapped up in that. It was sort of, this was seen as a political football that could be used to sort of, that's a really horrible mixed metaphor, but like could be used to sort of beat up on trans people since there was a lot of appetite in the legislature to produce an attack bill of some kind. And so it was sort of a perfect firestorm for trans people, which is one of the dangers in Indiana pursuing something like a hate crimes bill, because it's going to be about trans people. And, they will circle back for trans people if they don't like the way that debate is going.
And this is also what is really hard about the law, is that obviously I think everyone should get an ID that is accurate and affirming, and there should be no barriers whatsoever to that. You just go into the BMV and you're like, hi, give me this thing. And they're like, okay, here's your thing. But given the political climate, that often dictates our advocacy strategies, because we don't want to create a situation that is worse than someone not being able to get an X gender marker and ID, which would be a change in the law that restricted even more people from getting IDs. And that is, I'm not going to swear because this is going to be on the internet, but that's just crappy and isn't how it should be. But that is why we don't have amazing, awesome laws, is because people like me, and less extent the ACLU, concerned about like, if we do this, what bad could happen? And then like just that whole balancing act is really hard. I mean, no shade to the ACLU.
Yeah.
Kind of on things that at one point in time were doing good things for us, and now with political climate, things change. Speaking on the Affordable Care Act, there was some coverage of for transgender individuals, and there's been, at least I've been noticing some changes that have come that way, or suggested changes, which makes it really confusing about what the ACA actually says about transgender folks. So if you all can kind of talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, so over the course of the past nearly 4 years now, throughout the Trump presidency, we've seen a sort of dedicated rollback of policy, not law, but policy that is, intended to protect trans people that was enacted during the Obama administration by way of, often like executive orders, rules changes, things that the executive branch can do relatively rapidly without having to pass it through sort of a now unfriendly, House. These are things that Trump can do to sort of offer red meat to his base. And excuse me, there is a proposed rollback of trans protections that do exist in the ACA. That rule change is not completed. That as it currently stands, it is. And what happens, what the rules say and what actually happens are two different things. But on its face, insurance companies cannot categorically deny coverage for gender affirming surgeries or any particular care for trans people. There's also been a proposed rule change for the health department to enable medical providers to simply refuse any care at all to trans people if they don't approve of them, providing sort of a religious, what they call sort of a religious exception so that people can have a right of refusal. That's of questionable legality. I'm sure Megan has a lot more to say about all of that. But I do want to say as of right now, ACA, under the ACA, if you are trans, it is illegal to simply categorically deny treatment, whether that's surgery or anything that might be part of your medical journey if you have one. They can't simply have a blanket exception that they don't cover this if they are, if they, and generally speaking, it is probably illegal for insurance companies generally to have a blanket exception to that rule. Of course, we know that there are plenty of examples of such refusals. That does still happen. I know that like ILS, for instance, has done some great work in Indiana on sort of fighting those kinds of exceptions. It can still be a very difficult journey to get insurance coverage because the people who are being denied coverage are often people who lack the resources to sort of fight back, who may not have easy access to the legal system, which is why we're so grateful for organizations like ILS. But generally speaking, I think a lot of stuff happens. A lot of people get denied without really much recourse because of the costs involved in fighting that fight.
Yeah, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, no, I mean, not a lot, but so I think what Kit touched on is that Trump is doing all these things to try to undermine what, if I'm working on an individual case and not thinking about like how to advocate against the Trump rule, is a very clear law that, when I approach a company, an insurance company or an employer who's denied coverage, like my confidence level is extremely high that I am right and that they must, under the ACA, cover, they can't have this blanket exclusion or, whatever the medical issue is. My confidence level is very high. And I think that a lot of moderate or ignorant, in not a bad way, lawyers who are working for these insurance companies who don't have animus understand the legal framework is very much in our favor, that like there's lots of cases that support the position that you can't have this blanket exclusion. But then there are people who don't have that and have have animus or hatred or whatever about trans folks, and then try to use what Trump views as a loophole in the law that is, I think, not a loophole in the same way that they view it, to try to say, no, I'm allowed to do this either because of this proposed rule or because this, that, or the other. But I think when you get to the nitty gritty of like someone comes to us because they're surgery was denied, or their like estradiol patch was denied. Like we do those all the time, and usually we just send like a mean letter and it gets resolved because the people on the other side know that their case is not that strong. But that doesn't mean that like big, religious employers aren't going to take up that fight.
Right. And it doesn't mean that they're not going to try in hopes that they don't have access to lawyers who will write that mean letter to them and they can just get away with it.
Exactly. But if folks do get, any kind of denial for gender-related care, either because their employer just has a blanket exclusion, or because they say, oh, well, this T prescription is outside our limits, or you can't have a gel, you have to have this or that, like contact us. And there's a lot of advocacy that can be done to get folks the medication that their doctor deems medically necessary.
Kind of along the same line, I want to kind of also touch upon last Friday, there was some proposed changes to some policies within HUD in regards to federally funded homeless shelters and their denial of services, and some just awful, just terrible guidelines on how to identify people who don't present enough masculine or enough feminine to peg them as transgender and to deny them services. So if y'all want to talk a little bit about that, because I think that's kind of fresh on people's newsfeed right now, and probably have a lot of questions about that.
So to know if folks are feeling, oh, I'm echoing, that's crazy.
You're fine.
Okay. First thing to know is that those rules are not in place yet. They're still under public comment, and I encourage people, and before this is over, I'll try to throw a link up, to go and leave public comment on those new rules, quote unquote rules. They are really disturbing, but they're also really predictable. There's been a lot of signaling about this issue for a long time. We've known that something was coming. The short version is that a lot, particularly here in Indiana, if the subject is Indiana, a lot of our shelter system is run by religious organizations who already enjoy significant religious exceptions to deny service. I mean, I think that's wrong. I don't think anybody should deny someone shelter, appropriate and safe shelter based on their gender. But I would also say that, in some ways, this is very just signaling. I will say that the portion identifying how to identify trans people by physical attributes is troubling in a constitutional sense, as well as just morally offensive. I think that there's always a fear, regardless of what the legal framework is, that when such rules are endorsed by the highest authorities in the country, that individual workers, whether those rules are enforceable or not, whether or not those rules are held up in court, whether or not they're being fought, there's always a fear that individual people are going to feel empowered to sort of become their own police. We already know, for instance, that sort of the bathroom panic has resulted in people who are not trans being, harassed in restrooms for not looking enough like a man or a woman. And I think that we're heading down that road. And we're also, this is my last point, we all celebrated a great Supreme Court victory recently based on sex-based discrimination in employment. And, the Supreme Court essentially finding that discriminating against someone because they're gay or because they're trans is in fact sex discrimination, which it is. And this new rule set, particularly with the guidelines for identifying people, seems like a textbook guidebook for a Supreme Court challenge on the definition of sex in housing law, because you have a situation where you are clearly outlining a class of people and providing instructions on how to selectively deny them certain rights, which seems like that's almost like teeing up the ball. I'm not a lawyer, but it seems like teeing up the ball for some fairly serious constitutional challenges.
I would think so. Again, I'm not a lawyer either, and I'm sure Megan's nodding her head saying, yeah, yeah.
But I'm not that kind of lawyer, but
Right.
yes, I imagine the ACLU lawyers who do this sort of thing are like,
yeah,
hold on.
I think we can expect that if that rule were to go into effect, that you would see cases filed rather rapidly. And like my own feeling is that you'd probably see an injunction on it fairly quickly because it is such a radical departure. Most civil rights law does not, like does not provide us with like a guidebook for how to identify people to deny them specific rights. That's
no, we're usually much more subtle about it.
Yeah.
As you should be. So we have a question. It says, what are the current workplace protections for LGBTQ folks in Indiana? Is it the same in St. Joe County? What are protections for HIV positive individuals in the workplace? Because I moved here from Southern California and because I have been denied services here because I am gay related to religious freedom. What sources do I have to fight against that type of behavior? So we can kind of address each one of those. So talking about workplace protections for LGBTQ folk, Kit, you started to talk about the SCOTUS case that just happened. So I'm gonna leave that open. So just recently in June, the SCOTUS case, Supreme Court issued that you can't discriminate against somebody because of their sexuality or their gender identity in the workplace. And how does that kind of just overall, how does that protect us?
Which one of us should I do?
Whoever wants to go first.
I think you should go and then I'll go.
All right.
Okay.
All right. So the short answer is most companies cannot discriminate against you in employment based on your sexual orientation or gender identity. The short answer is you cannot, nationwide can't be fired for being gay or lesbian or transgender or bisexual. There's still a lot of road to go, I think, in terms of that in state courts and circuit courts. But I think that like we should, you do have grounds to challenge that, and you should reach out to, if you're a former employer who discriminated against you was a government organization, you should reach out to the ACLU of Indiana, or in other cases, maybe Indiana Legal Services, who might be able to talk to you about what your options are in terms of challenging an unfair and discriminatory firing. In terms of the other components of non-discrimination, the answer is far murkier and like far more complicated. So there are three pillars of what we call like classic non-discrimination. We talk about discrimination in employment, housing, and public accommodation. Those are the federal civil rights laws define those as sort of what we're thinking about. Of course, we know discrimination is much larger, but in terms of what we can protect against in the public sphere, employment, where you work, housing, where you live or where you seek shelter, and public accommodations being everything else, the public square, businesses, offices, and those two, the public square and housing, those have not been settled yet nationally. So we still don't have the same kind of surety that we have for the rest of the country. So in some places in Indiana, it is legal for, well, I don't even want to say it's legal because, of course, I believe that it's actually not legal for constitutional reasons. But there is no specific state law and no specific federal law preventing someone from hanging up a no gays allowed sign. There's no specific law preventing someone from telling you that they won't sell you a cake, that kind of thing. That's something that remains to be determined by the court. Now, you may be lucky enough to live in portions of the state that are covered by a non-discrimination ordinance. I know South Bend has one that has, protections, and perhaps a local human rights commission that you can make a complaint to. Those are local ordinances. In Indiana, we just passed, I worked on passing so many of them right after RFRA happened, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act happened, and the thing that launched Mike Pence's glorious career. And we have, there are many places. Indianapolis has one of the country's oldest, actually. There's like, it's about 20 years old at this point, that includes gender identity and sexual orientation. So the short answer is, for everything other than employment, there is a patchwork of municipal ordinances and state laws, and no real surety. And some of those ordinances are better than others. And I also have to give you that. Like, honestly, I have concerns about South Bend's in terms of its enforceability. I'm not sure that I can think of an example where it has been enforced. So some ordinances are very strong, they have teeth, and some of them are relatively weak. So that was more rambly than I expected it to be.
I agree with what Kit said, but again, it's sort of like the big picture, like what work do we need to do? And then if I have a case of someone living in like Tipton County, which has nothing, my confidence level of bringing a case about housing discrimination is actually pretty high, because it's not as high as employment and it's not as high as school, but it's pretty high. And that is because the way federal courts that cover Indiana talk about housing discrimination is super positive for LGBTQ folks and is really similar to the employment law cases. So there's a lot of parallels there, and there's a lot of, we have a long history of cases in this area that cover Indiana, that are federal courts, like that sits up in Chicago, that is really positive, and that I think those cases in general, that the law is on our side, I'm very confident about. The public accommodation, like hanging up a no gay sign, that is, like my confidence level is lower, but it's not that like, oh, you're SOL because you live in a county that doesn't have a protection. It's that, what are the facts of those case, and based on those facts, do we think we can bring a claim under these laws that maybe are a little murkier, and it would be much better if we had a statewide law. But it's not that if you're outside of one of these counties, and the South Bend LGBT Center is going to send a flyer I made about discrimination that is it doesn't have all the nuances of like, we still need a state law, and like, but it's that there are ways to challenge discrimination that you face, and that even if you live in a place that doesn't have one of these local ordinances. But how that plays out, just like employment cases, like a lot of people are discriminated against every day, you can't prove it. So even if someone comes to us and says, I was fired because I'm trans, like, I believe you, there's nothing that we can do to prove that, which can make an individual case very weak when the law is very strong, and vice versa. Like, there could be a case where the law is a little bit meh, but the facts are just so outrageous that it sort of becomes a much stronger case.
I had to chuckle a little bit that you mentioned Tipton, because that's where I grew up.
I was supposed to go there tomorrow. I'm very sad that now I have a remote hearing.
You're not missing anything.
Hey, we'll all miss the pork festival.
Oh, that's true. Some really good pork chops there, I'm just saying. So yeah, thank you for covering that. There was a bit of that in there that I did want to touch upon, especially because HIV is such a big part of the LGBTQ community. What are the protections for people who are HIV positive? What kind of anti-discrimination policies or laws are in place for those who are?
The only laws that cover, that make it unlawful to disclose someone's HIV status or discriminate against them are in the healthcare context, either because the HIPAA covers disclosure or because you can't be discriminated against under arguments under the ACA. But in terms of like, can a caseworker at whatever shelter or wherever tell the whole world you're HIV positive? Like, I wouldn't take that case.
Yeah.
Whether there are other advocacy strategies to educate people about why discrimination based on HIV or like disclosure is really bad, separate issue. But in terms of just like I don't, maybe I'm wrong and Kit is like, no, Megan, there's this great thing you don't know about.
I was hoping you had something I didn't know about,
No.
to be honest. And it is a shame because we do know that there's that folks who are positive still do suffer from discrimination.
There's an incredible amount of stigma around it still.
It's the unfortunate reality of living in Indiana that sometimes the answer to those questions is, yeah, we don't know. Like,
yeah. And I think sort of in the want category of, or answer to that question, discrimination by religious organizations, that's a bag of worms. That's our confidence level in those cases is low, but our experience is low. So we would typically we refer to private lawyers who have a lot more experience dealing with all the religious freedom issues. That wasn't part of the Supreme Court case.
Right.
I think kind of because of like the funeral home had like a crappy lawyer. Like, I don't know why they didn't think to raise that, but that wasn't in front of the court of whether or not, in the big ACLU case for Amy Stevens, whether or not the funeral home could have discriminated against her because of their sincerely held religious beliefs. Thankfully, that wasn't part of that case. But
a little bit of a follow-up question on all of this. A question on how can we here in South Bend strengthen our local ordinance? What are some other, Kate, you talked about some other places that have really great human rights ordinances that have a lot of teeth and enforceability behind them. Where are some places that we can kind of point to say, if we want to try to make ours better, who should we be looking at to see how they've crafted theirs and created theirs? I mean, you don't have to answer this right now, but if you have some ideas or examples, you can share those later, and we can put those up on our website as well. But I just wanted to throw that and say, if you knew of one off the top of your head, you're like, oh, you should check out.
I was gonna say Indies has stood for a long time.
Yeah.
And has some enforceability provisions. And I think that, like, generally speaking, we look for ordinances that cover both sexual orientation and gender identity explicitly in their list of people you can't discriminate against. And we look for ordinances that have teeth. And by teeth, we mean there is a body that can be appealed to with a complaint, a process for determining whether that complaint's valid, some kind of legal process, and the ability to leverage, for instance, a fine or something of that nature, so that the person making the complaint can get redress. And so we have some enforcement. The kind of enforcement that you can do in a municipal ordinance is always going to be somewhat limited, but one of the other unspoken enforcement tools for that kind of ordinance is the complaints like that tend to, in our age, make waves, and cities don't want that. Cities don't want the rep of being the place where someone couldn't plan their wedding or whatever. Sometimes the mere present, I mean, I don't want to undercut the importance of them, even though they are often,
Sure.
They're often purely decorative. That sometimes the fact of their existence it acts as a disincentive for companies operating in in that city or town to discriminate just because that we know that that town doesn't want that. And it's a nice clear message that they can send.
Yeah. Also, people had sent me a question on any local LGBTQ political groups. Unfortunately, I don't know of any here in the South Bend or Michiana area that are working specifically on political issues surrounding LGBTQ folk. You know, the center, we can do some advocacy work, but it gets really tricky with our 501c3 status. But yeah, definitely anytime we can educate and like tonight, offer up as much information about what's out there, what still needs to be done, definitely we will share that. The next couple of questions that I have kind of center around schools, because we here at the center, you know, have a pretty healthy youth program, and I get this question a lot. People ask, can public school officials keep us from having a GSA, a gender and sexualities alliance?
Oh, no, it.
They can try. They can try.
Right.
Do, but that's clearly illegal.
Yeah.
It's completely unconstitutional. We win those cases every single time they come up.
Yeah.
I think the question is like, does the ACLU win them in their sleep, or do they have to roll out of bed to win them?
That is a direct. That's an invitation to a lawsuit. And schools still do try. We had one last year. Who, you know, school maybe just isn't ready for that discussion, and so and really that's so I'm my background is as a high school teacher. And, you know, in some cases, I mean, it is animus, but in some cases, it's not classic animus. It is school administrators who are just by definition allergic to backlash from parents. They're just very scared of backlash from parents. And so their instinct is often, if something seems scary to them, to say like, no, we're not doing that. Typically when that happens, when you get a denial, when you're a student who's trying to, you know, if you have a young person who's trying to start a GSA and you get a denial, all it generally takes is a quick letter from our legal team, and that denial is reversed. Just that schools often do have like a school lawyer, who generally that person is not a constitutional lawyer. They're there for like a lot of reasons, and they wear a lot of hats, and it's often someone giving them bad legal advice, allowing them to believe that they can do this. But no, schools can't prevent you from forming clubs based on any particular interest, as long as they're not interests that inherently violate the safety and the, you know, the rules of the school. You know, and certainly it's not against the rules to be gay.
Right.
Well,
as much as they would like to try to make that rule, they can't.
Yeah.
And right there with you, I find a lot of school administrators, sometimes they're ignorant of the law and they don't realize that it's illegal for them to do it. And like you said, they don't want to create backlash. So they just say, no, I don't think this is a good idea. Let's not have this. And, you know, sometimes it's they're not aware that they can't do that, or they're in hopes that the student isn't going to do the digging or be well educated enough to know that you can't do that. So sometimes it's ignorance on the part of the administration. Sometimes it's hope of the ignorance of the students too. So
Yeah, and I know this was an issue of bathrooms, but we see the same thing when a trans kid wants to use a bathroom that corresponds to their gender. You know, a lot of school administrators are like, we see a lot who say, no, you have to use the bathroom that goes to the sex you were assigned at birth. But a lot of schools say, oh, I don't know, why don't you just use the nurse's bathroom? Because I think they genuinely think they are trying to be affirming to that kid. And then when you're like, no, and then you'd say to the lawyer, you're like, no, then they sort of see the law and they get that, like, even though there might be some backlash to law, it's pretty clear that you have to do that. But I think a lot of there's a lot of animus out there, but I think a lot of educators are often trying to balance these factors that don't need to be balanced. That it's like, just let the kid use the bathroom or just have the GSA.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I know up in this area recently, probably about 7 months ago, that topic of restroom usage was I think it was North Manchester School Corporation was talking about it, and it was really interesting. I went to the board meeting that they were having about it, and they had a lawyer from their district, and then a lawyer for the Superintendent's Coalition in Indiana come and talk about it, and both lawyers were like, I mean, you can deny and they can sue. Case law is not good on our favor. We're probably going to lose, and the school's going to have to fork out, several $100,000 in court fees as well as paying the plaintiffs in this instance. So they were like, "We're not telling you what to do. We're just giving you the facts."
And you see that, like the ACLU, the law, there's no federal, like the employment case was only about employment, but the way the federal school cases work really tracks that. So again, my confidence level for school cases has always been very high. Now it's like even higher. But we see that, the ACLU, the law in our federal little bubble is really good. The ACLU, sues routinely and gets money for people because after they say like, hey, you can't do this, they just do it and then they lose.
Yeah, our client in Evansville got, we can't really talk about the specifics, but the damages claim. So that was a nice little bonus on his way out of school to college.
Yeah.
And so like you don't want to.
An unexpected scholarship.
You don't, but it is true that schools could be opening themselves up to damage claims by discriminating against LGBTQ students in those ways. And so, just like with GSAs, they can try. But I think that right now we're feeling a lot of confidence that the courts are with us on this issue.
Yeah, and just like letting folks know that if this is happening to them, find it. If young people can't tell their parents about it, find another trusted adult to like help get some advocacy, because there is I think more solutions than most young people realize.
Yeah.
And then they can call us, they can call the ACLU.
And if they don't have your contact information, they can contact us and we'll hook them right up. So there's been a lot of activity around that in the last couple of years. So I just, there's no law that says you can't discriminate against it. But I want to let people know that, the case law on that is piling up against people who want to discriminate based on that. So
I think that's what's really hard about living in a place without a statewide law, because you can't point to it and say, this one thing that is one paragraph long says you can't do what you're doing.
Right.
Because really, I say in 5 pages, you can't do what you're doing, but there's not like a clear one sentence, one place to be like, go Google this thing, and then you'll see so clearly it says, do not be an asshole to children. Like, it doesn't say that. And so that's why, discrimination cases, whether it's in employment or school or housing, there's a lot of misinformation because there's not a thing you can point to, but that doesn't mean that there aren't remedies when it happens.
Yeah. Some other things that I mean, we're rapidly coming close to the end of our hour, and I just wanted to touch on a few other things. Speaking about like the prison system, just wanting to clarify what rights LGBTQ folks have when it comes to being incarcerated, especially with trans people. A lot of times they're not being put into they're being put into prison populations that they don't identify with. So I kind of want to, and also, I'm going to throw them all together here real quick. Also kind of talking about, like those who, again, trans people who are on hormone medication and need that, can they be denied that while they're in prison? Other medication, if they're HIV positive, or can they be denied for those medication and medical services while they're incarcerated? So I'm just going to throw those out there.
I have a lot of things to say, but I'm going to defer to the ACLU because of our funding. We actually we're prohibited from representing people who are currently incarcerated, but in my old life, I did represent people in New York
Sure.
who were. So I'll let Kit go, but I have many things to say about that.
I
Sure.
have just a few because I'm not a lawyer, but I do know that no, you cannot simply deny people access to medically necessary medication. We have a couple of cases ongoing against IDOC for denying medication to trans inmates, and we'll see how that goes, because this is kind of a topic that is finally sort of reaching the point where we're getting intake on it, but the short answer is you can't deny someone their HIV meds in prison. That comes down to really the courts determining what's medically necessary. The IDOC has for many years followed a standard when it comes to hormone treatment to trans people. I actually forget the term, but essentially the standard is they lock you where you are when you are incarcerated. So, if you're on hormones and you're at a certain dosage or whatever, that's what you can get if you get that. But like if you are diagnosed with severe gender dysphoria while you are incarcerated, their policy has long been that they will not provide you meds. We've been challenging that because of course you wouldn't deny someone treatment for chemotherapy because they didn't have cancer when they
or diabetes.
I hate to compare being trans to
Sure.
cancer, but when we're talking about medical treatment in this case, it's you don't deny people emergent issues. That's so it's a fairly ridiculous standard. And when it comes to housing, in practice, trans people can probably expect that they're not going to be housed appropriately in prison. It's one of the unfortunate, horrifying realities of our prison system is that, at best, a trans person can expect long-term isolation. If the prison has identified that this is someone who quote unquote who needs to be isolated from the population, quote unquote, for their safety. We see a lot of examples of people being placed in long-term isolation, which is horrifying. But it's very uncommon for a trans person to be housed appropriately, and that's one of the realities. I know the IDOC has some policy around that, but whether they follow that policy when they're booking, it just depends on so many factors. You might have a better chance of getting into the right jail cell if you have, updated IDs, but you might not. It just really depends on who books you and what they type into the computer. And there's just so many factors in it, and it very rarely works out in the trans person's favor.
Yeah. Well, thank you for talking on that, because I know that these are all issues. I mean, there's a lot more issues that surround being LGBTQ, especially here in Indiana, and we've hopefully have touched upon as many of the big ones that we can, and would love to have you both back at some point to do another round of this sort of activity. At this time, I just kind of want to throw it back to both of you if there's any closing thoughts you have, any information or advice that you'd like to share with the people watching. I'll start with Kit, since you both are like, who goes first?
Well, I don't have I don't know that I have a particular message I want to leave you with.
Sure.
I will say, don't allow if you feel like you have a discrimination claim, or if you feel like you've been discriminated against, don't allow your concern that maybe this isn't a big enough deal, or maybe you don't have enough evidence, or maybe don't allow that to prevent you from utilizing the resources such as ILS and such as the ACLU that are available. One of the problems I have as a community organizer is surfacing discrimination claims because people, they happen. You talk to your friends who it's happened to. You see people, on social media, and you speak to people in bars who have experienced some fairly heinous discrimination, stuff that is just clearly illegal. But if we don't get those cases, we can't build the case law. You know, all of the flagship cases that we've had on LGBTQ stuff at the ACLU have all been due to someone knowing that we took those kinds of cases and filing an intake with us. So like, if I can say that, it's like very important to reach out to get legal help if you feel like you've been discriminated against, even if you feel like you don't deserve it, or, we all have our own, like, I know I'm that kind of person too. It's like, oh, maybe this isn't my, like, maybe I'm not worth doing this for, or like, that's not true, you're worth it. And like, give it a shot, like write the email. And, hopefully you're the one that busts open something big, because that happens. I mean, that happened to us in Evansville. We had a kid who just, from my work in Evansville, knew about us, and we busted open the way schools treat the trans bathroom issue. So
and
yeah.
Go ahead.
No, that's it.
Oh, I was going to say, and how much does it cost for people to work with the ACLU?
$0.
Exactly, and that's what we like to hear.
Now, I will say we don't take all the cases we get.
True.
We try to, like, our lawyers, they apply a very complicated rule rubric that has to do with constitutional law and like case law, and
Right.
I'm not smart enough to know what it is that they do. But you never know until you try.
Right.
I actually would like Kit to get out of my head, because I was going to say something very similar, that, it's like, that if everyone asked for help, like legal help, or, if it's just like, a caseworker's help to like work through things as though they are entitled to everything in the world and more, then then it'll be, that's, ask for help, ask for legal help, call the ACLU, call us. Maybe a lawyer will say like, oh my God, that happened to you, can't do anything, but maybe they'll say, ACLU say, you're the next big case, or maybe ILS will say, you know what, we think we can settle this case, maybe we can get your employer to change their insurance policy, or get you back pay, whatever it is. That like, if everyone walked around as they were entitled to the world, all of us, all the LGBTQ folks, then, I don't know that that would change the fact of the discrimination to begin with, but it would certainly like make more people be held accountable for treating us like shit, like crap.
You already said it. It's fine. We'll fix it in post.
Yeah, so just ask for help,
Yeah.
And if someone's, and I think also this is going to come back to bite me, but if a lawyer or someone says, like, a friend says, no, it doesn't sound like a thing, say, like, push back on that.
Yeah.
And absolutely. I just messaged my email address to HR. I don't know if Megan wants to share hers.
Yeah, I'm going to do our intake one because it goes to everyone in the group.
I'm sharing my own email address simply because I can guarantee you, if you send your intake to me, I'm just going to forward it. You can also send it to intake@aclu-in.org. But if you're an LGBTQ person and you reach out to me for legal help, I will at least make sure that, one, it's sent to the lawyers, and that also just I, as a fellow community member, are offering you at least something, because that's, often in cases that we don't take. At the very least, I can connect you to somebody that can offer you support or help. We have a very wide and very strong network in Indiana, really awesome LGBTQ people who are always ready to serve, great organizations like the LGBTQ Center. So yeah, reach out if you need help.
And I'll just close with, we've been talking a lot about laws that don't exist to protect us. And there's something that each and every one of us can do to help with that, is make sure that you're voting and making sure that you're registered to vote. Make sure that you research your candidates that are there to represent you, and make sure that they are speaking to the issues that are protecting us, or the issues that speak to who we are. So definitely make sure that you get out and register. Kit, did you have some information about contacting to get some exemptions for COVID? I can't remember if you did or not.
Oh yeah, but I will have to do a quick copy paste job here.
That's okay, and we'll share that out too. So yeah, so if you can vote absentee to protect yourself, go ahead and do that, and request that early, honestly, because the closer we get to the deadline of that is, you know, which is October 22nd, it's going to be harder to get that turnaround time. But yeah, definitely make sure that you're voting, and knowing who you're voting for is really, really important, because that's the only way laws are really going to change, honestly. But yeah, thank you all for being here tonight, and thank you, Kit, and thank you, Megan, and thank you, Indiana Legal Services, and thank you, ACLU of Indiana, for all the work that you do and continue to do. So yeah, thank you, everybody, and hope you have a good evening.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.